G'day everyone, I'm the Gravetender, and welcome to the other side. What happened to the Terminator franchise? Seriously, when the first film came out, it gave people both an intense horror film and one of the best time travel stories in fiction. It relished in its absurd setup and yet worked because its overall plotline was relatively simple. After the first film, it had a sequel which quickly took the world by storm with its intense action set pieces and dynamic characters. Simply put, the first two Terminator films are easily some of the best sci-fi films to have ever been created, and the fact that we have never gotten a decent third film is a bloody tragedy. Every attempt made to revitalize and reboot this franchise has been a colossal disaster. It's gotten to the point that many people, me included, will just flat out deny that there are any other Terminator movies. The series ended with Judgment Day, and we haven't had a decent story in this franchise since then. Or have we? From Reef Entertainment comes what is quite possibly 2019's most underrated and unseen video game. One which gives fans of this franchise exactly what we've wanted, a genuinely good third entry in the Terminator franchise. So, let's talk about it. This is Terminator Resistance. Taking place in the far future, the player is greeted by a ruined Earth, now dominated by the advanced military AI Skynet. It's here, decades after Judgment Day, where we meet our protagonist, Jacob Rivers. The last surviving member of a resistance unit who'd been wiped out by a Terminator disguised as a human. Now alone in a war-torn land, Jacob makes an alliance with a group of refugees and with their help hopes to reconnect with the resistance and fight back against Skynet. It is a harrowing journey across America that will take you from abandoned train yards and hospitals to the Hollywood Hills. Everywhere you go there is danger, and despite being able to handle a gun, it becomes very clear very quickly that you are as helpless as all the other survivors. Which is why it's integral to build positive relations with any other humans you find in the world. After all, the last thing you'd want is to fight two wars at once. So you'll end up meeting a myriad of different characters on your journey, many of whom you'll be able to do jobs for and learn more about as the story progresses. Those who play a key role in the narrative have some extensive backstories, and honestly, I was surprised with how much detail the writers managed to put into each one of them. Still, I would have loved it even more if half the voice cast didn't sound as robotic as the machines. But that's another matter altogether. If you can look past the voice cast and instead focus on what's being said, then it becomes clear that a lot of work went into making all of these characters as dynamic as possible. None more so than Jacob Rivers, the player character. Despite clearly being set up as an ordinary soldier, events in this story make it clear that he is much more important than you might first realize. In fact, he even shares a direct link with the series' most important character, John Connor. However, I must say that I was really hoping for a much bigger payoff to such a revelation. What we got was fine, but I imagine if this game had a bigger budget and more time devoted to it, then we could have gotten a better reveal for it. Still, even with this in mind, what Jacob's story allows us to do is view this universe through the mindset of an ordinary soldier caught up in an extraordinary situation. As a whole, the game has a solid narrative, with plenty of twists and turns and callbacks to the films. It's clear right from the outset that this is a story that was written by people who loved this franchise and wanted to give it the justice it deserved. Unlike the films, which constantly fall face first into massive piles of shit. It's a story that isn't afraid to explore the darker aspects of this universe, evoking real terror in the player as they desperately attempt to fight back against a superior foe, which only makes the final hours of its campaign so much more epic and worthwhile. But before you can get to that point, first you need to survive against the initial onslaught, which is easier said than done. When it comes to the gameplay, it's your standard action shooter with some stealth and RPG mechanics thrown into it. It doesn't have any real gimmicks or twists to it, rather it keeps much of its design simple and easy to understand, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I'd say that this game benefits from how straightforward the gameplay is. After all, your character isn't some super soldier or gun-toting badass. You're just a normal human who utilizes whatever advantage he can over his enemies. In the beginning, you'll only have to deal with drones and armored spiders, both of which are easier enough to handle with your standard weaponry. But as the game progresses and the enemies get harder, you'll find yourself needing to replace your present weaponry with more advanced tech. This can be achieved in a number of different ways, and thankfully none of them force you to do anything too strenuous or time-consuming. Each mission is broken up into two categories. Either you're given access to a massive open map with a series of objectives and side objectives to complete, or you're presented with a linear level which features a myriad of combat encounters, both of which will encourage you to explore your environment and gather resources as you progress. But the more linear levels clearly serve to test your skills in combat, so it doesn't give you many options to run or hide, unlike the more open levels. However, to ensure the player is prepared beforehand for these linear levels, the developers have cleverly used the sandbox levels to provide players with everything they'll need, from new weapons to explosives and even just supplies for you to craft with. You never feel helpless during these combat-orientated missions because you've had the chance to prepare beforehand. This stops the linear missions from turning into difficulty spikes. The developers have clearly worked hard to balance the difficulty and make sure the player had all the tools they need to survive these missions. If not, then they give you some alternative method of avoiding conflict altogether. This is best showcased by the constant drip feed of new weapons throughout the game. You start off the game with some simple bullet-based weaponry. Pistols, machine guns, and submachine guns, which are useful for the first couple hours of gameplay, after which they quickly become outclassed by the myriad of different laser-based weaponry, which unlike bullets can actually damage Terminators and be upgraded, so there's more incentive to use these in combat while also helping the game to emphasize the importance of upgrading your gear, whether by constantly trading out weapons for more powerful versions or by using computer chips to enhance your present gear. From increasing your damage output to giving you more ammo or even improving weapon stability. The game gives you access to a myriad of different buffs for your many high-tech weapons to exploit. But it's best to keep in mind that every weapon in game has their own strengths and flaws. So it's a good idea to try out each of your guns before upgrading them so you know what you can improve on. Aside from upgrading weapons though, you can also upgrade yourself. Like I said, this game has a myriad of different RPG mechanics which are clearly inspired by some other well-known titles. You're given a set of goggles at the start of the game which allows you to see enemies through walls, giving you a significant edge when being stealthy. You also have skill trees which can benefit your weapons, health, and stealth abilities. Many of the skills you can unlock also can give you some major benefits, especially for the late game fights. But there's also tactical abilities you should invest in like lockpicking and hacking. The lockpicking is ripped right out of the Fallout games and even includes a mechanic in which you can force a door open, while the hacking minigame is literally just Frogger. No joke, it's a red and white version of Frogger with the difficulty naturally increasing as the game progresses. So it's not exactly the most complex hacking minigame, but it's not supposed to be. These systems are designed to help you explore your environment, motivating the player to search every inch of these surprisingly vast open maps for new gear and collectibles without detracting from the combat, while also giving you the means to infiltrate more secure locations and provide you with an additional challenge. These minigames can often reward you with some new resources or provide you with a new way to damage your enemies. Frankly, I can't count how many times I've hacked into an automated turret and turned it against its own allies. Reef Entertainment have worked hard to encourage you to use these gameplay mechanics for your own benefit, and they've clearly succeeded. After every mission, you'll return to your hideout to trade, craft new items, and talk to NPCs. Learning more about these people is integral to progressing their individual storylines and acquire side missions from them. Doing both will gradually allow Jacob to earn their trust, which plays a key role in the many dialogue choices that can take place throughout the game. In a surprising turn, Terminator Resistance includes a number of complex moral choices which can result in some major consequences if you're not careful. But depending on how you treat your fellow survivors will ultimately determine whether they'll be able to survive the endgame. So it's always best to consider how you respond to these characters. Of course, if you're going into this expecting a dozen possible endings and a multitude of diverging pathways, then you're going to be disappointed. These choices are mostly tied into the side characters and don't go far to alter how the campaign plays out. For the most part, the story is very linear, with the only real noticeable change coming at the end. It's quite clear that creating a story with multiple pathways and endings wasn't the developers' intentions. Rather, what these dialogue choices do is give the player the chance to see this futuristic war from a multitude of different perspectives without disrupting the basic gameplay loop. This, along with the rest of its gameplay, allows Terminator Resistance to instill within the player a sense of dread from the moment the game begins. You feel like you're constantly outnumbered and outmatched by a superior foe, that the only reason you're still alive is because you're able to adapt, and you'll definitely need to adapt if you want to survive your first real encounter with the T-800 Terminators. In the beginning, when you first encounter these machines, you have no real means of fighting them yourself. You're stuck in a hospital with some basic gear and no other options but to hide or run. You're forced into a situation in which stealth is your only option and hacking turrets is all you can really do combat-wise. So when you finally attain a plasma rifle and can do some actual damage on your own, it's seen as a momentous occasion. Your first step to fighting back. But as it becomes quickly apparent throughout this game, whenever the Resistance takes a step forward, so does Skynet. They create new weapons, new hazards, and new forms to combat you. From small snake-like machines which explode on contact to the massive HK tanks which can tear you to pieces in a matter of seconds. Skynet can be as diabolical as you, so knowing when to fight and when to run is essential to staying alive in-game. Managing your resources will quickly become second nature, as is utilizing the myriad of drugs and other enhancements to alter the landscape of the battlefield. Yet while at first you might be helpless, in time you'll become as destructive as the machines you're fighting against. All the while utilizing an arsenal of weapons taken straight from the films. Although, while the enemy AI can be quite relentless, it is at times quite unrefined. Aside from the T-800s, most of the enemies can be easily led in circles or simply struggle to hit you. Often you'll even find them moving in peculiar directions or getting stuck on the environment. This is especially common for the airborne hostiles or larger enemies. Still, when the AI is at its best, it's impossible to ignore how bloody terrifying the T-800 Terminators are. At times it makes you wonder how you're going to defeat Skynet, and this sentiment is shared throughout the story. Humanity is truly the underdog in this fight, and the developers know it. So it was quite the surprise that in November of 2020, Reef Entertainment surprised gamers with a free update to Terminator Resistance. This update would include a new game mode which put you right in the shoes of Skynet's favorite murder machine. Terminator Resistance's Infiltrator Mode consisted of a single mission in a large open map and gave players control over a single T-800 infiltrator unit. The mission itself is rather simple. Find and terminate an officer of the Resistance known as Daniel Ramirez. Overall, it is a relatively short experience, taking competent players less than an hour to complete, but it does feature several new additions to the gameplay. For starters, as a T-800, you're naturally much stronger than the puny humans you're hunting. So if you're able to sneak up on them, then you can casually pick them up and toss them like a sack of potatoes. Furthermore, fall damage is pretty much non-existent. However, as a trade-off, you can't naturally regenerate your health. Instead, you must find repair units throughout the map to heal. You also have a secondary visual mode, which turns the screen red and highlights objects in your environment. But unlike Jacob's goggles, Terminator Vision doesn't let you see enemies through walls. These additions do a good job of separating you from Jacob Rivers in the main game, but that's not all. You can't lockpick doors or hack into terminals like you could in the main game. Instead, you now have the option of forcibly breaching access points throughout the map, emulating the breach and clear events throughout the Call of Duty franchise. This is a perfect way to showcase how powerful the infiltrator unit is in combat, and if you're fast enough, you can clear out an entire room of enemies before any of them can even put a scratch on you. It's one of the many new additions that are included to demonstrate that Infiltrator Mode is a combat-focused game mode, with a large emphasis on finding new weapons and taking apart the Resistance as violently as possible. As such, you can find a number of weapon stashes throughout the map, each of these usually containing new weapons for you to use. From miniguns to grenade launchers or even the 45 long slide pistol, all of these iconic weapons from the films feel as powerful as you'd imagine. But when compared to the main game, there's simply more options for experimentation when it comes to the weaponry. Of course, when compared to the main game's relentless AI, the human AI is pretty straightforward. They won't rush you or relentlessly push you from a dozen different directions. For the most part, they simply stay put and hide behind cover, occasionally taking shots at you when the opportunity arises. They're mostly a threat in large numbers, but for most of this game mode I didn't really feel like I was in much danger. They're pretty generic and safe when compared to the myriad of different foes you can fight in the main game. Overall, Infiltrator Mode lasts as long as it needs to without feeling like a chore. If nothing else, this game mode gives you the chance to indulge in some more of this game's superb sound design. From the plasma rifles to the text emerging within a Terminator's HUD or even the simple footsteps of a T-800. There's something wonderful about hearing all these iconic sounds thundering in your ears, all the while having the original Terminator theme provide you with an exemplary soundtrack as you go from one chaotic combat encounter to the next. Having Brian Fidel's original theme recomposed for this game is simply a delight. Even after all these years, it's still as thunderous as when it first appeared on screen. It's simply the perfect blend of ominous and epic notes combined into one singular track. Listening to that while firing a plasma rifle at hordes of Terminators is simply enthralling. Frankly, this game is worth it simply to hear all these iconic sounds being emitted by your own two hands. I only wish I could say the same for the graphics. Even after moving this game over to the next generation, the graphics aren't what you'd call stellar. When you're exploring one of the open maps at night with the natural lighting, the game simply shines. But whenever it's daytime and you have a clear view of your surroundings, these graphical details become quite bland by comparison. While the character models for the humans are nothing impressive, they do manage to provide most of them with enough detail to separate them. So thankfully you're not constantly talking to the same face and body throughout the game. Although there are many instances in which this game's outdated graphics are put in the forefront, whether through a cutscene or during some of the characters' animations. At times it feels like your character's more of a stiff machine than an actual person, which granted makes sense in the Infiltrator mode, but for the main game, that's simply disappointing. But this is likely another issue brought about by a limited budget and time window. Fact is, if this game had been given the promotion and budget it deserved, then we could have had something truly unique here. But in its current condition, it's easy to see why so many people are put off by this game and its last-gen graphics. Yet, I think it's safe to say that Terminator Resistance is much better than it has any right to be. For a movie tie-in game, it somehow managed to achieve what the films haven't been able to do in years, and that's tell a genuinely good Terminator story. With some top-notch sound design and excellent usage of the film's music, this game is able to make you feel like a helpless babe one minute and a badass Terminator hunter the next. But when accompanied by its simple gameplay and lack of originality, it can be difficult to get invested into its narrative. Still, if you're a fan of this franchise and have been as desperate as I have to get a proper third entry in this series, then this is the perfect game for you. At the end of the day, it might not be what we were hoping for, but it's good enough for me. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. I'm the Grave Tender, and thank you for joining me on the other side. Please consider subscribing, and I hope you all have a nice day.